Thank you, Colin. I do remember some of those evenings back in Edmonton a long time ago. They were fun. And I look around this room and it's tremendously gratifying. I see people I've known here almost ever since I moved to Ottawa in all sorts of capacities, whether it be some of my museum colleagues at the back or people I play music with, and certainly lots of people that are involved with the literary community with me. And I'm really, Julie, I'm really happy to see you all, and thank you very much for coming out. Thanks to Black Squirrel, certainly thanks to Brick, who have been kind enough to not only publish our books but to supply all the goodies at the back. And certainly thanks to Tree. You've been a mainstay of poetry in this community for a long time, and I'm not the only person who appreciates that. Lots of people do. I'm going to read from a new book, Tateo Placente. The title comes from the birth of my daughter about 5 years ago, which wasn't a particularly difficult birth, but there were some complications afterwards which led to the poem. I'm going to read only 2 poems, and before you get too excited about that, I should tell you they're long poems. They're in short parts, but there are a few of them. And unfortunately for you, that's what this book is made up of. It's essentially a collection of poems that my default mode is writing in a sequence, and all of these are sequences. Almost all of them have appeared as chapbooks or in one form or another over the past decade, although one particular series goes back almost 25 years. It's a series I published in Prairie Fire like decades ago. Somehow made it into this one. I'm going to read 2. One's kind of funny. The other one's not so funny. And I'll start with a funny one. It's first appeared as a chapbook from Cameron Anstey's Apartment 9 Press. It's just called A Poem That Ends with Murder. He is building a narrative with constricted air and a room abandoned by everybody else. There is the affectionate fauna of his breath to keep him company. He has told the same story before with its gaps and false starts and underdeveloped plot, and yet all he can do is keep on telling it. Some people dream, but he's been banished from the dream world. Instead, sprites and angels that guard the entry reach for their earplugs and turn away. It's gotten so that he is turned on by their backs, the moles and curves and the inconsistent vertebrae. That too has become part of his story. He thinks the deaf could love him, but damned if they'll listen. He awoke one night with a thumb and a forefinger pinched over his nose, and once with a pillow over his face, and once with a knee in his back. Okay, more than once. Once there were kids setting off fireworks in the park, and once with sirens blaring outside. Even in his sleep, what he wants is an audience. In the part of the brain that's active when he sleeps, primitive jealousies light up. It's just as well that no one can see him. Though he is worried about the faint glow that seems to come from the base of his skull when he wakes up in a sweat, his arms around the remaining pillow. The confession is suctioned out of him at length every night. Yes, I did it. It feels better to tell someone, but there's more. There's something that confesses to him, that ratchets its little amours into his breath every night and says, yes, yes, I did it too. It's worst when he lies on his back, when he's facing the darkness with his lopsided nose and his exposed genitalia, and the darkness keeps saying, we can't hear you. What is it that you want? But it's also bad when he lies curled up on his side in the favorite position of the species, and although there is no one to snuggle with, there is nonetheless the same question, and the same, if somewhat muted, attempt to answer. The only possible relief is when he sleeps on his belly. Whatever is going on behind him, it happens there. And they just take one look at his hairy ass, and they don't even ask. Lately, it's gotten so bad that he's snoring even before he falls asleep. The heavy book falls from his hand. He snores. Then his head drops, in that order. And then, and this is the saddest thing, he wakes up and looks around to see if anyone noticed. When he tried the device given to him by the dentist, it was like having another mouth inside the one he thought was his. The new mouth never says what he expects it to say. But then, neither did the other one. Once, we got to stay in a jacuzzi room at the Moulin Rouge Motel because our campsite got flooded and that was the only room left in town. This was in Sturgeon Falls. It was so bad, he eventually slept out in the truck. Yeah, well, once we had to stay in a lot of places, and there's no point in complaining about them now. In fact, after a while, complaining just starts to sound like nostalgia. Once, we had to stay in this little panza in northern Hungary, and in the middle of the night, just so everyone could sleep, he had to sneak off into another room, which was, luckily, unlocked and vacant. But the hostess found him the next morning, and although he wanted to pay for the extra room, she was laughing too hard to take his money. The breakfast sucked, though. The more he tried to stay awake, the more tired he became. Well, what would you expect? Since he could not dream, he came to love his snoring, claiming that it was equally the working out of a problem the conscious mind couldn't solve. He even claimed in his expansive moments, and in the face of some contrary evidence, it was a kind of song. An attempt to sing into being whatever was in his head. She was unconvinced. She said, the only way this will end will be with a murder. I'm going to read one more poem, and the title poem from the book, which is a little fraught, although the end result of the whole process was really fine. It's called Meditatio Placentae because part of our placentae was retained after the birth of our daughter. And we didn't discover that for about 6 weeks, and it was a little traumatic when it happened. Everybody's fine, but it was exciting for a day or two. One of the things that I think is interesting about this poem is the way the eye of the writing keeps moving around. It's not comfortable just sitting with one voice or with one thing. And so if it's sometimes a little bit confusing as you hear it to try and figure out who's speaking, it's because the speaking voice shifts a little bit. I came out too, with just as much of the necessity, but none of the adoration. I have to assume the world will contain us. Not the mother, or the child, but something unembraceable, and always between this place and another. The midwife took me in her gloves and spread me on the cold tray. She said I was complete, but that's never been true. Even now, I want the rest of me to show up and be similarly loved. I never asked for the needle either, no matter how enhanced it was with its minute corrugations so it shows up better on the ultrasound, and still it doesn't know what it's looking for. It slides through my expanded cells, through the apart of surfaces, and tastes the order of what will disappear. All good flesh will. But what it wants now is just a sample of the fluids, the ones that focus the attention and amplify the repetitive heart. If we could see through it. I never asked for anywhere else, and yet every somewhere else is within me. And when I threaten to detach, it's gone. When the time comes, the broken water disappears into the seam of itself, and then the carry-on full of small bones, articulated as an eye, will also disappear. They will be expecting me then. And what would be the point of hanging on? Just to be the lining of belief after belief itself is gone. Put it to music, I say. Already, I can hear the wailing. We did eventually take the placenta and dug a hole in the front yard and put it in and planted a hawthorn tree, which is in flower as we speak. I came out, and it is the going out that concerns us, with a kind of plop. Not exactly the celestial soundtrack all the attendants in their hospital gowns expected. And for a while, I am in and out of the body, like the soul escaping in one of those voluptuous old paintings with angels instead of midwives, but with the same kind of drapery. They were supposed to examine me, but with all that bright light and finery, who can blame them for a certain distraction? The body always retains something of what it gives up, a trace of what's gone. But of course, the body has also been given up by something with a different audio. I came out with a kind of plop. And then there was another but less emphatic plop when they dropped me in the yogurt tub so the angels could carry me back home. Typical. They put the baby in a sling and planted the prickliest tree they could find to celebrate her birth. A hawthorn. According to some, it's a contraindication for vampires. To others, it made the crown of thorns Christ wore on the cross, and sometimes it still groans with the guilt and the bureaucracy. Or it marks a door to the world of fairies and preternatural births. They don't believe any of that shit. And were in such a distracted rush when they planted the tree, they forgot to throw me in the hole. And early next morning, they had to go and get me out of the freezer and do it over again. They defrosted me in the microwave. But at least they didn't try to eat me, like some people do. And after all that fuss, how could I think I'd leave nothing behind? That I would fall onto the wet sheets, onto the soak of light without regrets, without a trail of clots of repeats of fragile genomes to follow back home. The midwives were wrong and careless, and I was bound to forget. But what is forgotten must also exit the body, and the unscraped languages it is put together with. Dilate the passage. Curette the pieces, spoon-feed the hungry world. 6 weeks postnatal, and she was bleeding onto the floor at the triage desk at the Montfort. And the doctor who saw her 8 hours later sent her home at 2 a.m. saying that she had just gotten her period unusually early. And still bleeding, she came back the next day, and it took another 5 hours and an ultrasound to determine there was a problem. And even then, it wasn't until she had bled through all the bedclothes and her hemoglobin level had fallen past critical that they had concluded that there was any reason to respond. They had to scrape the so-called products of conception from the uterine wall. And after, they stood at her bedside and congratulated themselves for catching it just in time. That's what I was, a product of conception. I learned that those who cause the greatest pain have the kindest voices. I never wanted to know. I never expected to be human. So, finally, I have been removed. Whatever it is that remembers can stop now. Elsewhere oozes into the hawthorn. Whose eyes are those? What isn't open in the body? No one will look for resemblances, and I will resemble, nonetheless, all of you. Thank you.